What I'd love to do is invite you to come forward if you would like to. We think that the 4:30 slot means that it's going to be a bit sparse. If you want to sit in back, that's still fine. It's still okay. But what I'd like to do is just invite everyone to participate. We're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. But what we'd like to do is leave you with at least an understanding of how to approach zero trust. So before I start, I'd love to get a raise of hands. How many have zero trust initiatives in their company today? Anyone? How many are familiar with the concept? How many are not familiar with the concept, maybe is a better way to say it. Okay, we have a good mix, I think. We have some that are in projects, some are familiar with it, and some not. Well, as we go through this, I hope to leave you with at least an understanding of what the elements are to zero trust. You'll hear a lot of companies say that it's just about the network, but it's more than that. And hopefully we'll leave you with an understanding of how identity-centric approach to zero trust gives you a lot of flexibility, as well as gets you to really some of the goals and the approaches that are necessary. We'd also like to make sure that you have an approach, meaning where do I start? We have a lot of our organizations and companies we work with that just say, I don't even know where to start, and we'll hopefully give you a framework to do that. And then we'll talk about how to take that journey. So once I have the framework, once I've done an assessment, then we'll give you a pathway to get there. Sound good? Look for head nods? All right. So first thing I'd like to get into is really what are some of the goals? And if I go quickly through this, the goal is really just about how can I provide as granular of control to the access to the resources I possibly can. It's really about the more information I have and know about someone, the better I can protect then the resources they have at a very granular level. If you look about the approach, there's a lot of discussion going on in the security arena where if you provide security in a centralized fashion, you start to gain that centralized control, but what it does is take some of that control away from the app owner. What's been happening as we look at standard, as we look at different new technologies, you'll hopefully see through this approach that you can actually take a centralized approach to a policy. It's almost a policy as code kind of an approach. And then you move enforcement close to the app. And so once you look at this, your goal is to get as granular as you possibly can, and then the approach is centralized with enforcement distributed. Now, if you take the next step, it's really about starting with some of the principles. So first off, there's 3 principles to zero trust. The first is that it doesn't matter what network you're on. It doesn't matter if it's inside or outside the firewall. The network no longer can protect from insider threat. You really have threat from external identities as well as internal identities. You also have the case where public networks really and private networks are almost the same. We talked to a lot of our customers that do a lot of their business operations out on the net. They consume SaaS services as well as they keep things internal, and they're roughly treating them the same. And then last is just to admit to us that we need a change and that we need to have continual assessment to be able to ensure that you understand the security framework, the security foundation of your platform. So what that really does, what it means then is I have to first manage all of the devices and users that come in. I have to verify those devices and users. I also have to authenticate and authorize access to those devices and users to the resources that I'm protecting. And in a more modern fashion, it's not only just about authenticating and authorizing, but I have to continually assess, continually monitor the access for them. And that's really done through an orchestration layer that you'll see in some of the frameworks we'll get to. Yeah.
Something I want to add is, for those who haven't really heard of zero trust or aren't looking or haven't had any background on that, how many people have heard of ransomware? Okay, so the same principles that apply to mitigating ransomware are the same principles that will apply to zero trust. So if you're having a problem with ransomware, or you think you're going to, or you want to find out whether you're going to be vulnerable towards a ransomware type attack, these same principles apply to preventing those attacks. So I like to put, when I talk with a lot of customers, they want, they can see that better than, well, why zero trust? Why do I need to control the identity and to control the device and to control the network? I mean, that's really hard, but why? And these principles will help them with ransomware. It makes it a lot easier to explain to be able to, implement this.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. Yeah, I think there's a lot of metaphors. If hopefully by the end of this, you'll find that the frameworks can apply to all kinds of attacks and all kinds of threat vectors. One thing also we wanted to bring to bear is there is this discussion in the industry. How many have raised a hand, understand, or have heard of zero trust network access? Sort of. How many have heard of zero trust identity access? A few of you. And I think there's two different lenses out in the market. And as you talk through your zero trust strategy, there really isn't one approach. I think you have to look at a balanced model. If you look at the network-centric approach, they really are about establishing implicit trust to be able to control either information going out or information coming in. When you look at an identity-centric approach, it's really about defining least privileges and be able to ensure that you have the granularity that's required. Now, you look at also then with those two different philosophies, it's really about how do I best protect resources, and it's just not web apps anymore, it's APIs, it's data, it's access to particular information either via consent authorization or the organization granting trust or granting access to that. So if we take that balance between the network as well as the identity, it really is simplified down into 4 different steps. You first have to manage the device. So you've got to trust them and manage them to enable a user to be able to get onto them. Then you have to authenticate. So if you are strongly authenticating a user and you ensure that that device is managed and secured and paired with that identity, you start to develop that initial trust. Second, you have to dynamically authorize. Anyone know what that means? Anyone want to take a guess? Just shout it out. What? MFA. So strongly authenticate is more on the MFA. And when I talk about dynamic authorization, it's really about bringing intelligence, bringing information into that authorization process. So I know who you are, and I've granted you access, but now I want to be able to ensure, based on the latest contextual information, what you can and can't do. And then last is just to ensure that your enforcement, it sits at the edge. So that's really taking all those principles and breaking down into manage the devices, pair them to an authenticated user, authenticate who they are, make sure you have the latest contextual risk information about the user before you grant access to that resource that's protected by the network. Now, if you look at one of the fundamental principles is that you've got to look at your full ecosystem. I remember having a conversation with one of our partners, Microsoft, and they said, yeah, we can do it all. And the more we peeled the onion, we started to say, well, not really. You may have some network or infrastructure security service. You may have some identity services. You may even have a way to manage devices. But the thing you're missing is really a full layer strategy around that. And so at Ping, we talk quite often about identity is really at the center. And then there's relationships established with the various layers within the environment. Now, when we were looking at a zero trust strategy, we did a few things. We said, all right, then let's take identity at the center, and then what kind of relationships do we need to have? Some of it leverages identity technologies, others work with other providers. This is just a map, it's a bit of an eye chart for those in the back. But that mapping gives you a sense of those things that are identity-centric, things that get to know who you are. We verify who you are. We give you MFA capabilities to strongly authenticate who you are. And then we give you the ability to protect those resources. But what do you do when it comes down to, I want to make sure that this phone's been jailbroken or not? I need some kind of managed service, or I want to apply DLP to that device. I want to be able to secure the network at the edge. I want to be able to secure at the edge before they access a SaaS app. Those all require an ecosystem to work together by this framework. Now, if you go to that next step then, as you look at those things that Ping provided, were all very identity-centric, and we'll talk a little bit later about the journey that you would take with Ping, as well as in how do we connect to some of these partners. But this just gives you a map of our view of the ecosystem. Now, how many of you have vendors that are up on the board in your network? There's some of those vendors downstairs, and you can talk to them. And so take BeyondTrust, for example. They're very strong in privileged access management, a key component to be able to secure access to your infrastructure, something that is working well together with Ping. You can start to provide very strong authentication. You can ensure that that privileged account has the right level of protection to protect the resources that they're getting into. So once you look then at that domain, those are all the players, all the different categories essentially within a zero trust framework. Then you need to break down the domains. And those domains are again on that identity realm, device realm that we talked about before. But you can see now that it's identities pairing with the device before they can access the application, the data, or the service. And then what does the network do in helping protect access either to those resources that are inside the firewall versus outside? And so we translated that all into a reference architecture. So consider an identity-centric reference architecture really does start then with two things kind of as core. The first is an authentication authority, and that sits in the middle and does a few things. Anyone, again, back to the MFA question, does an authentication authority manage what kind of authentication types, what kind of authentication methods are used? Yes, thank you, head nod. So an authentication authority is really there to help adjudicate decisions. And so I remember I was at a large airline one time and they said, you know, we have 40 different roles, and some of them are on the tarmac, some are agents at the desk, some are pilots that are disconnected in the airplane. They all need to authenticate strongly, but we need a bunch of different methods. Some of them are doing it offline, some of them are doing it on a kiosk, some of them need to use a glove, and so it's a different kind of method that they're authenticating. And that authentication authority sits in the middle of that and helps manage which type of authentication is required. Dynamic authorization is the same, because that authorization is really the policy administration and decision point for determining who and what and under what context they can access a specific resource. And then orchestration really sits underneath to help manage that user experience. We'll talk a little bit later there. Anything to add, Steve? Or?
Yeah, I think a good example for this will be hospitals, because hospitals don't want to spend a dime unless it's going to make healthcare to patients easier. And so being able to use kind of an automatic authentication, they can log in and do their multi-factor one time, but they want to be able to go from kiosk to kiosk, in different rooms and just do like a one-touch on their badge. So maybe every 2 hours they're going to re-authenticate, but you want to make, on the end user, you still want to make it as easy as possible for them, because when security starts getting too difficult for the users, then they just don't want to do it. They're going to find a way to get around it every time.
Yeah, thank you. So consider then the reference architecture or all the piece parts. It's not quite a deployment architecture, but at least talks about the pieces that are there. The next thing I wanted to bring up is considering the user. Something that happened, I think, during the lockdown was it really shifted the value of the end user. So consider an employee used to be treated like, okay, it's good enough security. Well, that's changed. Once they went remote, they started to act a whole lot more like a partner or a customer. And so you look at Zero Trust then is really about, how can I leverage the best security and technology and create the best user experience? And what's been interesting is by bringing both together, having the right pieces and then the right experience, you actually can improve that security. Now, a few examples of that is that verification now, it's very easy to leverage online verification technology using live selfie match against your driver's license or passport and be able to onboard someone in a self-service flow. Consider then profile management allows you to do progressive profiling, where you may know a little bit about a user, but over time, as you get to know them better, you can start to grant more access. All again, better user experiences as we go forward. Take authentication and authorization. We talked about them of just requiring a lot of different factors and authorization to be able to ensure what they can get to. And then you have some legacy systems. You also need to manage what they're entitled to. That's either by managing groups, managing attributes about those users, or distributing, essentially sending group information down to the application so they can secure it. The last two ones are really where we then start to bring in a little more of that network layer and level of access control. It's now how do I protect? And so can I get signals? Can I get feeds from my client device? Or can I get signals from the network that tell me what that posture is, tell me what the risk level is there? Then be able to detect if there is anomalistic behavior or there are threats, and then be able to respond and react to that. And so it's really that user experience, walking them through that Zero Trust security framework that's worth considering. Yeah, please.
Add to that, the detect and respond is really important with that. Again, I like to roll things back into a why. Why do we do things? I was that irritating kid that was always asking why. And so when we're looking at that detect and respond and putting that into the entire big picture, it's like, again, going back to ransomware. If somebody clicks on a link and then they end up getting, allowing somebody onto their machine, the first thing they're going to do is try to, enumerate the network and find out what other machines they can get on using those credentials. Well, if they don't have MFA, they're pretty much stopped right there. But you also want to have that detect and respond to know that, hey, something's happening here where this user is trying to move from this machine to this machine, but not in a normal way or not in a normal behavior. So that's kind of the why behind that last slide.
Yeah, that's great. And this is really just that next stage of take that last slide, bring in that flow, a user experience across that, and then how do some of those technologies relate? So hopefully I'm giving you the way to connect to from the elements, the piece parts, down to the actual user experience that's there. Now, the next thing we'd like to talk about is, so where do you start? Zero Trust is a big elephant. You look at all those different security categories, those areas that you have to consider. And one thing that had happened over the last 2 to 3 years is that companies have come out with frameworks. So NIST came out with, I think that's the special publication, it's what, 802.207, I believe. And then you have the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency came out with a framework. And that's really what you see here. Now, this framework's important because it takes those building blocks that are there and then allows you to do an assessment. That assessment's just to determine where you're at against all those capabilities, all those technologies we had. So we talked to some customers that are like, we don't even have single sign-on nailed. We have single password, and everyone logs in with the same password on a lot of different machines. And we have others that are like, oh, they've got strong authentication, and they're even using risk scores to bring in. A large pharmaceutical customer of ours, they went through that journey of single password to when they added federation to do single sign-on across all of these. They added multi-factor authentication, and they added risk. And it gave them a way to sort of mature through that process as they brought identity forward. So you look at the framework, and then let's jump to the goals real quick. When you look at a Zero Trust maturity model, you really are looking not only at the technology, but also the operational framework within your organization. What this does is if you take a maturity assessment, the first thing you can do is develop an enterprise level strategy, because it allows you to know where to start, where you're most vulnerable, and where you're okay. It allows you to determine an execution roadmap, and we'll give you a journey of how we feel you should take that approach. But that execution roadmap gives you a plan, and then it also gives you a continuous delivery model. It really sets you up to where you can say, now I know where I need to deliver and what I need to maintain to be under a Zero Trust framework going forward. Now, some of the outcomes of the program I think are important because it allows you to say, you know what? I've got buy-in from the executive team because I'm doing the assessment and then I'm building out the execution and plan to align to. It also lets me assess, I have some good technology. I think every one of the enterprise customers I work with all have something there that you can start with. It's mature, at least it's in a pretty good state, and allows me to then take my existing technology and make it add value going forward. And also lets me identify where I've got gaps, things I need to actually bring into the framework. And then last is, by taking this assessment approach, by taking a Zero Trust strategy, you can actually put in the framework and start to identify where am I mature enough operationally versus where I need to make some change. One thing to look at then is take that framework, take that assessment level, and this is a major eye chart, so I'm just going to highlight thematically so you can see it, but the material would be left for you to reference. But this gives you a way to look at, so from an identity standpoint, a company like Ping would help you go up that journey, ultimately go from password to multi-factor authentication to actually doing risk-based continuous authentication, something that I think is critical. A company like CrowdStrike would take you up the device path. It would take you from just a managed device to be able to know about the device and be able to lock down that device. And you can do that on each one of these categories going forward. And I think the framework gives you a way to say, I'm going to start, and all I want to do is get my identity to that kind of advanced level. But because our data is so critical, I'm going to get that up to the higher, more of that optimal state. So it gives you a framework to make some of those decisions. Anything to add?
No, I'll talk a little bit more about that aspect
on
one of my slides later.
All right. And then the last few things is you take that framework, and then you need another place to start. It's really more of your implementation strategy. So our advice is that you build your implementation strategy on how to develop the best user experience. And so you take those same principles of establish and build trust, and then protect your resources. I know we have to do them at the same time, but from a maturity standpoint, if you can just really lock down and make sure the identity is authenticated and it's paired with the device, your ability to then make sure that they are the right user to be able to grant access to what they're entitled to is better. So we talked about establish your authentication authority first, Next, you establish your authorization authority, so you not only can capture who they are coming in. Once that session's established, now I can manage the authorization in a continuous fashion. Once those are established, then you start to provide intelligence, so you go up that single sign-on to multi-factor authentication to risk. You can start to graduate and mature on that vein. And then always, just the more you can start to automate and provide that react respond framework, the more you can actually bring some maturity in the insight that you provide. We then can start to have a really kind of a security operations framework for your zero trust deployment. So last few things here, and I'm just trying to be sensitive to time, is that there are some capabilities that are necessary for what Ping believes is the modern identity capability. You need to start with verifiable credentials. That's for your employees. If you have a customer facing, make sure that you are introducing verifiable credentials to ensure that you know who they are. Those are really the implicit ways of authenticating someone. Profile management's critical. I can't tell you how many companies we've worked with that have been able to materially change how they operate by putting in progressive profiling. It allows you to then create a good experience, learn who they are, and be able to extend that. Risk signals. If there's anything that we've heard over the last 2 to 3 years is the more signals I have, the better I know who you are, and the better experience I can give you. You actually take a lot of friction. And then you imagine getting to that passwordless state where you don't require a password to authenticate can actually be achievable if you can actually have the right signals to, again, know who you are and then know is there any vulnerabilities or not. The last few things then is just multi-factor authentication, still very critical, but multi-factor authentication is becoming less and less explicit and starting to enable implicit controls. And so imagine if I know who you are, I know and trust the device, I know it's managed, I know I'm inside the firewall, I'm going to let you in. I know you well enough and I trust well enough that I can allow you a very seamless experience versus if you're brand new, you may or may not be a bot, I really don't know who you are, I'm going to require a lot more controls and I might require you to come in with a stronger authentication. And then last is just the things we talked about before, the authentication authority and then the authorization authority. So I'm going to click through a few slides fairly quickly, but just try to then tell that journey. So take those capabilities we talked about, and then take that journey. First, we start with that authentication authority, and it really is just to centralize and provide single sign-on everything. You start to look at adding multi-factor authentication. You start to then identify and verify those users. Those are great starting points because, again, the better you know who the person is, you can grant them access to the resources that you want to protect. But beyond that, then you have some resources, and one of the most vulnerable places in an organization is their own people having access to some of the back-end systems, those admin accounts. And so privileged access is very important. But imagine a world if I could do single sign-on across everything and then add privileged accounts on top of that. I have a secure network for those infrastructure services that are there. And another thing to consider is then managing those devices. Next step then is once I've authenticated, I have a session established, now I need to provide continuous authentication through the flow. First thing is to centralize your access policies. Be able to have one place that the security architect controls and resources can come into that central authorization and say, may or may not access this application. That the authorization authority can also take signals, so it can take information and say, I will grant you access, but you know what? I've noticed you haven't accessed that application for a long time. It's been over a month. How about we step you up and make sure that you really are who you are before I grant you access? Even though you're entitled, I'm going to still check to see who you are. And then last is that you need to start working with the network enforcement layers. There's companies like Zscaler that sit at the edge, and they do a great job of interfacing with identity, provide protection to SaaS applications that are out on the public internet. So once we have the authentication authority, the authorization authority centralized, then we start to feed it. And this was really that story about that large pharmaceutical company. They got everything protected. The user experience wasn't great because they had a lot of explicit interfaces, a lot of authentication happening. But what they were able to do is start to gather more and more information that's really there for security principles to help make better decisions. And then what it now allowed them to do is then get to know the user as they can, allow them access when they feel that they know the user well, and then step up and provide unique policy when they don't. And then last is just that notion of once I've brought the signals in, ensure that you are working with some of those network providers to provide that security operating center, provide that ability to very easily react and respond and enforce certain policies. One example is, we work well with a lot of the network access gateways as well as the API gateways, and they become our enforcement point for policy. And it's been a good tool to protect APIs, to protect web resources or some data resources. So let me pause there, and I apologize if that felt rushed, but happy to answer questions or else we can talk to you downstairs. But I'm going to give Steve a few minutes to talk about how ping and CDW work together.
So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with CDW. We're like the largest security solutions and services provider in North America now. And when it comes down to the zero trust and what we work with ping as far as implementation services, managing them, sales, but CDW as a whole does everything on this eye chart. So when we're talking about identity, network security, data application, CDW can do that. Implementation services. The other thing that we provide is we have a zero trust rapid assessment. It takes about 2 weeks to complete, and we can give you a really good idea of where you stand with the zero trust as a whole, and then help you develop a plan to get to that to compliance with that framework. And in general, CDW across the board, even outside the zero trust, we can do everything from program a strategy. A lot of the customers that I talk to, I'm a field CISO. I talk with folks that a lot of them don't even have a security leader. That's the director of IT who's also acting on behalf of the security team. And so I help them build strategies around that, and even through training. And some of the training would probably be interesting to a lot of the folks here as I walked around downstairs, because it's all developed around security. So malware reverse engineering, and if you're a SOC, if you're like a SOC level 1 engineer, if you want to get to a SOC level 3 engineer, we can actually give you a test to find out where you're at, and then develop a training program that gets you up there to build your security skills up. But again, across secure infrastructure and everything that needs to deal with zero trust, because again, it's not just one thing. You may hear vendors say that if you use us, we can get you to zero trust compliance, but not one vendor is ever going to do that. But we can actually help implement multiple vendors and integrate them into a zero trust framework. And that's it. I'm done.
That's great. So, questions? Who felt that was rushed? Anyone? It's a lot of slides to get to, we understand, but we thought it would be good to be content rich. Leave it as leave behinds, give you the framework that you can work from. But any questions?
On one of your architecture diagrams, you had, kind of like how you split things up. You had the circle in the center with kind of the 5 areas, and you had a bunch of kind of dot map type branches coming out.
Yeah.
And then you showed a second version of that slide that had partner names on some of them. There were an awful lot of areas that had no partner names on there. What do you do to address those?
It's interesting how I had one other slide that was way too busy that we actually have partners in every one of those areas. This was more of the landscape to fit what I think are core. But take like the software-defined perimeter layer. We work with Akamai, we work with ClearTrust, we work with some others in those areas. So there's our companies that we work with those. And we found that there's these adjacencies, that some of them are far adjacencies in a different group, but we'll work with them. So if you'd like a follow-up, I can certainly share the full breadth of those partnerships that sort of map to it.
And I can tell you from my personal strategy is to look at what you're currently invested in and try to capitalize on that investment, what you've already built upon, and then finding the right partners to build around that to take up the other 4 pillars and integrate those together. And if you have something that is not going to be part of that framework very well, then we can set it out another way to where we'll end up doing the entire implementation. But I like to see where you're at first and then find the right partners that integrate well, because some partners don't integrate well with others.
Is Palo Alto common among many other groups? Zscaler? Anyone on Zscaler? We're starting to hear Zscaler a little more. I think it's because of that SaaS application they have, that kind of edge piece. CrowdStrike? A few of them out there. Cloudflare? Has anyone heard of them? Cool. Yeah, I'd have to say it's been interesting to go through Zero Trust because you start to question, how much do I need of legacy environments versus bring them forward? And what we found is you do. It's just a matter of how do you best bring them together. There are some edge applications or technologies that I think are going away. I hate to say it, but even like the SIM vendors, I think are quickly being encapsulated or captured by the security orchestration automation response, I guess, the SOAR vendors. And those are like the Palo Altos. I think you'll see CrowdStrike positioning around those. There's this XDR frameworks. All those would be the kind of conversation we would have if we get into a little more detail. Any other questions? All right, it's 5 o'clock. You guys were good. You stuck with us, so I appreciate that. Really do. And if you have questions afterward, come up.